The scarf had to come off, but 40 years of secrets don't unravel easily, especially when the man beneath it was dying on frozen asphalt, his fingers clutching wool like a rosary. Sarah Jenkins heard the ambulance sirens screaming through Millbrook's December air before she saw Thomas Mitchell's crumpled form outside Peterson's grocery. The same Thomas who'd worn that gray wool scarf through every season she'd known him, through blazing July heat waves and bitter February winds, through his wife Martha's funeral, and every day since. Now paramedics struggled around him, their gloved hands fighting his weakening grip as he whispered the same words over and over. Please, not the scarf. Please, don't let them see. The heart monitor's steady beep suddenly flatlined. We need airway access now, the lead paramedic shouted, reaching for scissors. But Thomas's eyes found Sarah's through the chaos, and in them she saw 40 years of terror greater than death itself, the kind of fear that makes a man choose suffocation over exposure. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, when the Michigan summer still painted Millbrook in shades of green hope, Sarah Jenkins had no idea that Thomas Mitchell would become the puzzle that would change everything. She'd driven down Maple Street countless times, always noticing the immaculate 1940s bungalow with its perpetually half-mast American flag, but never questioning why its owner wore winter wool in July heat. Thomas Mitchell was Millbrook's walking contradiction, a man who maintained his lawn with military precision yet avoided every neighbor's eye, who attended St. John Mary's Catholic Church religiously but sat in the back pew like a penitent ghost. At 85, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying invisible weight, his shoulders permanently hunched, as if bracing against storms only he could see. The gray wool scarf never left his neck, not during the town's 4th of July parade when temperatures soared past 90 degrees. Not at Martha's funeral in 2019 when grief should have made everything else irrelevant. Not even during his weekly Tuesday grocery runs to Peterson's, where checkout girl Jenny Morrison had worked for 15 years and never once seen Thomas Mitchell's throat. Sarah had been assigned to Thomas after Mrs. Eleanor Henderson next door called the county health department with concerns about a reclusive elderly man showing signs of neglect. As a home health nurse with 23 years of experience, Sarah had seen every variety of stubborn senior. But Thomas presented something different, a fortress of politeness that somehow felt more impenetrable than hostility. His house reflected the same careful contradiction. Every surface gleamed with obsessive cleanliness, yet all the mirrors were covered with dark cloth. Family photographs lined the mantel, but each frame faced down or turned toward the wall. The living room centered around Martha's empty recliner, positioned perfectly to catch afternoon sunlight that Thomas himself seemed to avoid. Sarah learned quickly that Thomas Mitchell operated on rigid schedules. Coffee at 6 sharp, always black, always from Martha's favorite mug. Grocery shopping every Tuesday at 10, the same route through town, the same items. Campbell's soup, Wonder Bread, bananas that he'd let ripen until they were more brown than yellow. He paid cash, never lingered for small talk, and drove home with both hands gripped tight on the steering wheel of his pristine 1995 Ford pickup. What puzzled Sarah most wasn't the scarf itself. Plenty of elderly people developed odd comfort habits. It was the way Thomas's entire body language changed whenever anyone looked too long at his neck area. His shoulders would rise, his chin would duck, and his fingers would automatically reach up to adjust fabric that was already perfectly positioned. The town had theories, of course. Millbrook thrived on gentle gossip, and Thomas Mitchell had provided decades of speculation. Some whispered about war wounds. He was the right age for Korea, maybe even Vietnam. Others suggested a terrible accident, a house fire, maybe a childhood trauma that never healed. But Sarah, watching him through her professional lens, saw something else entirely. a man not hiding from the world but from himself. July 15th arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Michigan summers feel like punishment. The thermometer outside Peterson's grocery read 87 degrees by 10 in the morning, and Sarah could feel sweat beading on her forehead as she knocked on Thomas Mitchell's front door for their first official home health visit. She'd expected resistance. Most elderly men bristled at the suggestion they needed help, but Thomas's reaction went beyond normal stubbornness. When he opened the door, his hand immediately flew to his throat, adjusting the gray wool scarf that looked suffocating in the morning heat. "I don't need help, young lady," he said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "There's been a mistake." Sarah had heard variations of this greeting 1,000 times. She smiled with practiced patience, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Jenkins from County Health Services. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson was concerned about your welfare. This is just a routine wellness check. Eleanor Henderson needs to mind her own business." Thomas stepped back, but didn't close the door. Sarah noticed how he positioned himself so the doorframe partially obscured his left side, the side where the scarf seemed thickest. "May I come in? It's awfully hot out here, and this will only take a few minutes." Thomas hesitated, his fingers working the scarf's edge like a rosary. Finally he stepped aside, but Sarah noticed how he moved, always keeping his right side toward her, never fully turning around. The house's interior felt like a museum dedicated to careful loneliness. Everything was spotless, militarily precise, but cold despite the summer heat. Sarah's trained eye cataloged the details: covered mirrors, turned-down photographs, a kitchen table set for one with mathematical precision. "When did you last see a doctor, Mr. Mitchell?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair he indicated, the one that put his back to the window, his face in shadow. "Don't need doctors. Take care of myself just fine." But Sarah could see he wasn't fine. His face was flushed beneath the scarf, perspiration dampening his hairline. The wool around his neck looked damp with sweat, and she could hear a slight wheeze in his breathing that suggested respiratory distress. "Mr. Mitchell, it's nearly 90 degrees outside. Aren't you warm in that scarf?" The question hit like a physical blow. Thomas's entire body tensed, his hand clutching the wool so tightly his knuckles went white. "I'm fine. Always wear it. Martha used to say. She used to say I looked distinguished." His voice caught on his dead wife's name, and Sarah saw the first crack in his armor. She leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice gentle. "Tell me about Martha." For 20 minutes, Thomas talked about his wife with a tenderness that transformed his guarded features. Martha had been a teacher, patient and kind, who'd loved mystery novels and hated cooking but did it anyway. They'd been married 44 years, had no children, had been each other's entire world. "She never asked questions," Thomas said finally, his hand absently stroking the scarf. "Never pushed. She understood that some things are better left alone." It was during this conversation that Sarah heard it, the phone ringing in the kitchen. Thomas excused himself to answer, and she could hear his voice change, becoming warmer, more authoritative. "Veterans Crisis Line, this is Tom. What's your name, son? I understand. I've been there too. Tell me what's happening right now." Sarah strained to listen without appearing to eavesdrop. Thomas's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, and what she heard made her heart clench. He was talking to someone contemplating suicide, his words careful and practiced, full of hard-earned wisdom about surviving dark moments. "The pain doesn't last forever," she heard him say. "I promise you that. I've carried pain for 40 years, and I'm still here. You can carry yours too, just for today. Just until tomorrow comes." When Thomas returned 15 minutes later, he'd transformed back into the guarded stranger. "Sorry about that. Wrong number." But Sarah had heard enough to know it wasn't a wrong number. This man who couldn't accept help for himself was spending his time saving other people's lives. The irony struck her like a physical blow. Here was Thomas Mitchell, clearly suffering, probably isolated, definitely struggling with whatever trauma kept him wrapped in wool during a heat wave, and he was using his pain to counsel other veterans through their darkest moments. As she prepared to leave, Sarah tried one more approach. "Mr. Mitchell, if you ever need someone to talk to—" "I don't need anything," he cut her off, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just, could you not mention the phone call to anyone? Some people wouldn't understand." Sarah nodded, understanding more than he realized. She'd found the key to Thomas Mitchell's puzzle, but she had no idea how to use it without destroying the very thing that kept him alive, his ability to help others even when he couldn't help himself. October 31st arrived in Millbrook with the kind of crisp Michigan evening that made jack-o'-lanterns glow brighter and shadows stretch longer. Sarah hadn't planned to visit Thomas that night. Halloween wasn't exactly a holiday for wellness checks, but something had been nagging at her since their last encounter 3 weeks earlier. Thomas had missed his Tuesday grocery run for the first time in anyone's memory. Jenny Morrison at Peterson's had mentioned it to her mother, who'd mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson, who'd called Sarah with the kind of concern that small towns specialize in. "He's never missed a Tuesday, not even when Martha was dying." Sarah found herself driving down Maple Street as dusk settled over the neighborhood. Every house blazed with Halloween decorations, glowing pumpkins, skeleton displays, fake cobwebs that caught the streetlight. Every house except 247 Maple Street, which sat in complete darkness like a black hole in the festive constellation. She knocked softly, not wanting to startle him. No answer. She tried again, calling out, "Mr. Mitchell, it's Sarah Jenkins." The door opened slowly, revealing Thomas silhouetted against the dim interior light. Even in the shadows, she could see he looked terrible. His face gaunt, his usually perfect scarf hanging loosely around his neck as if he'd lost weight. But what struck her most was his breathing, shallow, rapid, with a wheeze that sounded like rustling leaves. "Sarah," he said, and her first name on his lips surprised them both. "You shouldn't be here. Not tonight. Are you all right? You missed your grocery shopping." He stepped back to let her in, and she noticed how his hand trembled as he closed the door. The house felt different. Colder, though the heat was on, more isolated, if that was possible. "The children," Thomas said suddenly, his voice strange. "Do you hear them?" Sarah listened. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of trick-or-treaters, laughter, running footsteps, parents calling after their kids. Normal Halloween sounds that should have been cheerful. But Thomas was standing rigid in his living room, his hands pressed over his ears, his breathing becoming more labored by the second. The scarf around his neck looked damp with perspiration despite the cool evening. "Mr. Mitchell, Thomas, what's wrong?" "The laughing," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Happy children laughing. It sounds just like... His words dissolved into hyperventilation. Sarah watched him sink into Martha's chair, the first time she'd seen him sit there, his hands clawing at the scarf around his neck, not trying to remove it but pulling it tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping him together. Sarah had seen panic attacks before, but this was something deeper. This was trauma surfacing like a submarine breaching dark water, sudden and devastating. "Thomas, look at me," she said, kneeling beside the chair. "You're safe. You're in your house. It's Halloween night, 2023. Those are children trick-or-treating." "I know," he gasped. "I know what it is, but I also know what it sounds like." She stayed with him through the attack, talking softly, keeping her voice steady while his breathing gradually slowed. She didn't try to touch him or remove the scarf. She'd learned that much. But she stayed, and that seemed to be enough. When the worst had passed, Thomas sat in exhausted silence for several minutes. Outside, the trick-or-treaters had moved on to other streets, leaving Maple Street quiet, except for the rustle of autumn leaves. "They avoid this house," Thomas said finally. "The children have for years. Their parents tell them stories about the strange man who wears scarves in summer." "What kind of stories?" Thomas almost smiled, but it was bitter. "Nothing too creative. That I'm hiding something terrible. That I'm dangerous. Sometimes I hear them dare each other to ring my doorbell." He touched the scarf absently. "They're not wrong, you know. I'm hiding something terrible." Sarah felt her breath catch. This was the closest he'd come to admitting anything about what lay beneath the wool. "Thomas." 40 years, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. 40 years I've worn this thing. Martha used to ask, especially in the early days, "Honey, aren't you warm?" "Tom, maybe just around the house?" But I couldn't. Even with her. Especially with her. The weight in his voice was crushing. Sarah realized she was witnessing something that had been building for decades, a confession 40 years in the making. "She died never seeing," Thomas whispered. "My wife of 44 years died without ever seeing her husband's face. What kind of man does that make me?" "A man who was protecting someone he loved," Sarah said softly. "No." Thomas shook his head. "A coward who was protecting himself." The admission hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Outside, a car door slammed as late trick-or-treaters headed home, but the sound seemed to come from another world entirely. "The sounds of children playing," Thomas said suddenly. "Happy voices. Laughter. Do you know what that reminds me of?" Sarah waited, sensing he was on the edge of something enormous. "Vietnam, 1975, last month before we pulled out." His voice became distant, mechanical. "There was a village. Kids playing in the street while their mothers hung laundry. Normal life happening while we patrolled the perimeter." He stopped, his hand going to the scarf again. "Something happened there," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw 40 years of accumulated pain in his eyes. "Something happened to my face. Something I did to myself. Something so terrible that I couldn't let Martha see it. Couldn't let anyone see it." The confession cost him everything. He slumped in the chair as if the words had been holding him upright, and Sarah realized she was finally seeing the real Thomas Mitchell, not the careful fortress he'd built, but the broken man inside. The morning after Halloween, Sarah sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold and a decision that felt too heavy for one person to carry. Thomas's partial confession replayed in her mind like a broken record. The pain in his voice when he'd spoken about Vietnam, about Martha dying without seeing his face, about 40 years of hiding. She'd left him that night with a promise to return the next day. But now she wondered if she was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Her nursing training emphasized patient autonomy, but her heart kept hearing the desperation in his voice. "My wife of 44 years died without ever seeing her husband's face." By noon, Sarah had made her first call to the Veterans Administration office in Grand Rapids. The receptionist was polite but firm. They couldn't release any information without the veteran's written consent. When Sarah explained she was a healthcare provider concerned about a patient's welfare, she was transferred to Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a VA counselor who specialized in PTSD cases. "Thomas Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez repeated when Sarah provided the name. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. How long has he been struggling?" "From what I can tell, since he returned from Vietnam in 1975, he's been wearing a scarf constantly for 40 years, never removes it, even in extreme heat. He had a panic attack last night triggered by children's laughter." There was a long pause. "Ms. Jenkins, I need to ask you something confidential." Have you ever overheard Mr. Mitchell on the phone, perhaps talking to someone in crisis? Sarah's pulse quickened. Yes, I heard him talking someone through what sounded like a suicide crisis. He called himself Tom and mentioned the Veterans Crisis Line. Jesus, Dr. Rodriguez breathed. Tom, we've been trying to identify our most effective anonymous counselor for 15 years. He's talked down more veterans from suicide than anyone in our database, but he's never given us his real name or agreed to meet in person. We call him Guardian Angel Tom. The irony hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas Mitchell, the man who couldn't accept help for himself, had been anonymously saving lives for 15 years. He's been doing this while struggling with his own trauma? It's more common than you'd think. Sometimes the people who've been to the darkest places are the best guides for others trying to find their way out. But Mrs. Jenkins, if this is the same Tom, he's in serious psychological distress. We've noticed changes in his calls over the past year, longer pauses, references to time running out, mentions of joining someone named Martha. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Martha was his wife. She died in 2019. We need to help him, but we can't force treatment. Has he expressed any willingness to seek help? He won't even remove his scarf. He's convinced there's something so terrible underneath that no one could bear to see it. Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. I've seen cases like this. Combat-related disfigurement, real or perceived, the shame becomes larger than the actual trauma. Would he be willing to talk to me by phone? I could call as a follow-up to his crisis counseling work. Sarah doubted it, but she promised to try. After hanging up, she sat staring at her phone, thinking about her next call. She'd been putting it off for 3 weeks, but Thomas's confession about Vietnam had made it necessary. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed information for Charlie Company, 1st Infantry Division Veterans Organization. After being transferred 3 times, she found herself talking to a gruff-voiced man named James Patterson, who identified himself as a retired sergeant. Mitchell, you said? Thomas Mitchell? Patterson's voice changed completely. Holy hell, is Tommy alive? We thought he was dead. Sarah's heart hammered. He's alive, but he's struggling. I'm his nurse, and I'm trying to understand what happened to him in Vietnam. Ma'am, with respect, what happened to Tommy Mitchell is something I've been trying to forget for 48 years. Are you sure you want to know? I need to know. He's in crisis, and I think it's connected to whatever happened over there. Patterson sighed heavily. All right, but this doesn't leave us, understand? Tommy was our golden boy. 27 years old, college-educated, could have been an officer but enlisted as regular infantry. Said he wanted to serve alongside working-class boys, not above them. Sarah scribbled notes, trying to picture a young Thomas Mitchell. March 1975, last month before we pulled out. We were patrolling this village about 20 clicks south of Saigon. Real peaceful place. Kids playing, women hanging laundry, old men playing some kind of board game. Tommy always loved those quiet moments, said they reminded him of home. Patterson's voice grew heavy. We got intel about possible VC movement in the area, but everything looked normal. Tommy was walking point with Private Rodriguez. Good kid, 19 years old, engaged to a girl back in Texas. They were maybe 50 yards ahead of the main unit. Sarah held her breath. What happened next? Jesus, I still wake up some nights hearing it. Rodriguez stepped on something, not a mine, turned out to be a white phosphorus grenade rigged as a booby trap. Those things burn at over 1,500 degrees, ma'am. They don't just explode. They melt everything in a 15-foot radius. Oh, God. Tommy could have dropped back, waited for the blast. Should have dropped back. But he saw that kid Rodriguez standing there, saw the grenade between his feet, and he did the stupidest, bravest thing I ever witnessed. Patterson's voice broke slightly. He lunged forward and tackled Rodriguez, tried to shield him with his own body. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. What happened? The grenade went off while Tommy was on top of Rodriguez. Kid died instantly. Phosphorus went right through Tommy's back and got him anyway, but Tommy took the worst of it. Face, neck, shoulder, the smell. Patterson trailed off. But he survived. Barely. Medevac got him out, flew him to Japan for surgery. We heard he had multiple operations, skin grafts, the works. But then he just disappeared. Never wrote, never came to reunions, never filed for disability benefits. We figured the injuries were so bad we figured he'd died in the hospital and nobody told us. Sarah felt sick. The image of a young Thomas Mitchell throwing himself into fire to save a friend, then spending 40 years hiding the scars, was almost too much to process. He blamed himself, didn't he? For not being able to save Rodriguez. That's the hell of it, ma'am. He did save Rodriguez, gave the kid maybe 3 extra seconds of life, which doesn't sound like much unless you've seen men die alone. Rodriguez died in Tommy's arms instead of alone on the ground. Tommy whispered to him about home, about his girl back in Texas, about how he was brave. I heard it all from 30 yards away. Sarah wiped tears she hadn't realized were falling. So, Thomas was a hero. The bravest man I ever served with. But he never saw it that way. Last thing he said before the medevac took him was, "I failed him, Sarge. I couldn't save him." 48 years later, and I can still hear those words clear as day. After hanging up with Patterson, Sarah sat in her kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened, trying to reconcile the broken man she knew with the hero Patterson had described. The Thomas Mitchell of 1975 had thrown himself into fire to save a friend. The Thomas Mitchell of 2023 couldn't throw off a scarf to save himself. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed the number for Millbrook Community Hospital. Ms. Jenkins, this is Dr. Amanda Stevens in the emergency department. We have a Thomas Mitchell here who was brought in with respiratory distress. He's asking for you specifically, but he's refusing treatment. He says you're the only one who understands about the scarf. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. I'll be right there. Miss Jenkins, there's something else. We need to examine his throat and neck area to determine the cause of his breathing problems, but he becomes violent whenever we try to remove or even loosen the scarf. We're considering sedation, but given his age and current condition. Don't sedate him, Sarah said, already grabbing her keys. I'm 20 minutes away. Can he breathe? For now, but his oxygen saturation is dropping. Whatever's under that scarf, it's affecting his airway. As Sarah drove toward the hospital, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, she realized that 40 years of secrets were about to collide with medical necessity. Thomas's choice was no longer between dignity and vulnerability. It was between exposure and death. And she was the only person who might be able to help him make that choice. The hospital came into view, its emergency room lights cutting through the gathering November dusk like beacons. Sarah parked and ran toward the entrance, not knowing whether she was racing to save Thomas Mitchell's life or to witness the destruction of everything he'd spent 40 years protecting. Sarah burst through the emergency room doors to find chaos barely contained behind medical professionalism. Through the glass partition of Trauma Room 3, she could see Thomas Mitchell sitting rigidly on the examination table, his hands clutched around his scarf, like a man gripping a lifeline. 2 nurses stood at a respectful distance while Dr. Stevens spoke in low, urgent tones with the respiratory therapist. He's been like this for 40 minutes, Dr. Stevens said when she saw Sarah approach. Oxygen saturation hovering at 85%, but the moment anyone approaches his neck area, he becomes combative. We've never seen anything like it. Through the glass, Sarah could see Thomas's face was flushed and drawn, his breathing labored but controlled through what looked like pure willpower. His eyes searched the hallway until they found hers, and she saw relief flood his features even as his grip on the scarf tightened. "Let me talk to him," Sarah said. The trauma room felt charged with 40 years of accumulated tension when Sarah entered. Thomas tried to speak but could only manage a hoarse whisper. "They want to take it off." "I know," Sarah said, pulling a chair close to the examination table. "Thomas, your oxygen levels are dangerous. Dr. Stevens needs to see what's affecting your breathing. You don't understand." His voice was barely audible. "If they see, if anyone sees, I can't. I promised myself I'd die before I'd let anyone see." Sarah felt her heart breaking. This man who had thrown himself into fire to save a stranger couldn't expose old scars to save himself. "Thomas, I spoke to Sergeant Patterson today." The effect was immediate and devastating. Thomas's face went white, his breathing became even more labored, and his whole body began to shake. "Jimmy Patterson? He's still alive? He told me about Rodriguez, about what you did." "No," Thomas's voice cracked. "No, don't. Please don't." But Sarah pressed on, knowing this might be her only chance to reach him. "He told me how you tackled Rodriguez, how you tried to shield him from the grenade. He called you the bravest man he ever served with." "I failed!" The words exploded from Thomas with such force that his oxygen monitor alarm began beeping frantically. "Rodriguez died because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't smart enough, and my face, what the phosphorus did to my face, it's God's punishment for my failure." Dr. Stevens stepped into the room. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to intervene now. Your oxygen levels are becoming critical." Thomas shook his head violently, his hands white-knuckled on the scarf. "I won't let you see. I won't let anyone see what I really am." Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for months afterward. She stood up and gently placed her hands over Thomas's. "Then let me see first." The room went silent except for the insistent beeping of monitors. "Doctor." Stevens started to object, but Sarah held up her free hand. "Thomas, I'm going to remove your scarf. Just me. If you want me to put it back, I will. But you're dying, and this is the only way I can help you." Thomas looked into her eyes for a long moment, and Sarah saw decades of fear warring with exhaustion. Finally, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. With trembling fingers, Sarah began to unwrap the gray wool that had been Thomas Mitchell's armor for 40 years. Layer by layer, the scarf came away, and with each turn, she could feel the weight of his terror. His breathing became more labored, but whether from physical distress or emotional panic, she couldn't tell. When the last layer fell away, Sarah understood why Thomas had hidden for 4 decades. The right side of his neck and jaw bore the unmistakable scars of severe burns. Not the smooth surgical scars she'd expected, but the twisted keloid scarring that spoke of white-hot metal and emergency field surgery. The scars extended from his ear to his collarbone, pulling the skin into patterns that told the story of unimaginable pain and multiple reconstructive surgeries. But what struck Sarah most wasn't the severity of the scarring. It was how much smaller it seemed than the shame that had grown around it. The scars were visible, yes, and they told a story of trauma, but they were the scars of a hero, not a monster. "Oh, Thomas," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "You beautiful, brave man." Thomas's eyes searched her face desperately. "Don't lie to me. Don't pretend it's not horrible." "It's not horrible," Sarah said, and meant it. "It's the face of someone who ran toward danger to save a friend. It's the face of someone who's been carrying survivor's guilt for 40 years when he should have been carrying pride." Dr. Stevens had moved closer during this exchange, her medical eye assessing the scarring. "Mr. Mitchell, I can see why you've been having breathing difficulties. The scar tissue has created some restriction in your airway. It's treatable, but we need to run some tests. Thomas barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on Sarah's face, searching for any sign of revulsion or pity. Martha never saw, he whispered. 44 years of marriage. And she never saw her husband's real face. Maybe she did, Sarah said gently. Maybe she saw the man who came home from war carrying other people's pain along with his own. Maybe she saw the husband who loved her so much he was willing to suffer in silence rather than burden her with his trauma. The words seemed to break something loose in Thomas. For the first time since Sarah had known him, he began to cry. Not the silent tears of a man trying to maintain control, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve. Doctor. Stevens worked quietly around his emotional breakdown, checking his breathing, examining the scar tissue, making notes. When Thomas's crying finally subsided, she spoke gently. Mr. Mitchell, the good news is that this is treatable. The scar tissue has tightened over the years, and it's restricting your airway. Some minor surgical revision could help significantly. Surgery means more people seeing, Thomas said hoarsely. It means breathing freely for the first time in 40 years, Dr. Stevens countered. It means not dying from something completely preventable. Sarah watched Thomas struggle with the decision. 40 years of hiding warred with the possibility of healing, and she could see the battle playing out across his scarred features. Thomas, she said quietly, what would you tell one of the veterans you counsel? If someone called the crisis line and said they were dying because they were too ashamed to seek medical help, what would you say? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had talked countless people back from the edge of despair. I'd tell them that their shame was bigger than their scars, that the people who matter don't care what you look like. They care that you're alive. And I'd tell them that hiding their pain doesn't protect the people they love. It just makes those people feel helpless and excluded. His voice broke again. God, I'd tell them that their wife would rather see their scars than lose them to secrets. Sarah felt tears on her own cheeks. What else would you tell them? Thomas looked directly at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't try to angle his scarred side away from her gaze. I'd tell them that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people help you. That sometimes survival isn't about being strong enough to carry everything alone, it's about being strong enough to put your burden down. Dr. Stevens smiled. Does that mean you'll let us help you, Mr. Mitchell? Thomas nodded slowly, his hand reaching not for where his scarf had been, but for Sarah's hand. But I want Sarah to stay. She's the first person to see me in 40 years, and she didn't run away. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah promised, squeezing his hand. But Thomas, there's something else we need to talk about. Dr. Rodriguez at the VA wants to meet the man behind Guardian Angel Tom. Thomas's eyes widened. They know? They know you've saved more lives than any crisis counselor in their system. They know you've been healing other people while refusing to heal yourself. And they want to help you the way you've helped so many others. For the first time in perhaps 40 years, Thomas Mitchell smiled, really smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression he usually wore. The scars pulled at the right side of his face, but the smile was genuine and transformative. All right, he said. All right. Let's see what happens when I stop hiding. The week following Thomas's hospital admission brought a cascade of revelations that seemed to shake the very foundations of everything he'd believed about himself for 4 decades. Dr. Rodriguez arrived from Grand Rapids on Thursday morning, carrying a thick file that contained 15 years of documentation about the anonymous counselor known only as Guardian Angel Tom. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling into the chair beside his hospital bed, "I need you to understand something. In my 23 years of veteran crisis counseling, I have never encountered anyone with your success rate. You've talked down 47 veterans from suicide. 47 families still have their fathers, their sons, their brothers because of you." Thomas stared at the ceiling, his scarred throat visible above the hospital gown. Without the scarf, he looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, but also more present. "I just told them what I wished someone had told me." "That's exactly why you were so effective. You spoke from experience, from understanding. But Thomas, you can't save everyone else and abandon yourself. Carl Morrison called yesterday specifically asking to speak with you." "Carl?" Thomas's voice brightened. "The kid from Iraq? How is he?" "He's graduating from law school next month. He credits you with saving his life 3 years ago when he called the crisis line. He wants to thank you in person." Sarah watched from the corner as Thomas processed this information. She'd seen the phone logs Dr. Rodriguez had shared, call after call, sometimes lasting hours, with Thomas talking desperate veterans through their darkest moments. The man who couldn't bear to let anyone see his scars had been using his voice to heal invisible wounds in others. But the revelations weren't finished. On Friday, Dr. Amanda Stevens entered with test results that would shatter everything Thomas thought he knew about his medical condition. "Mr. Mitchell, we've completed the analysis of your scar tissue," she began, her expression serious. "I need to discuss something with you about the nature of your injuries." Thomas's hand instinctively went to his throat. "What about them?" "The scarring pattern suggests severe thermal burns, consistent with white phosphorus exposure. But there's something else. The scar tissue has been aggravated by decades of constant friction and pressure from the scarf. What you thought was hiding your disfigurement was actually making it worse." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "The constant pressure from the wool, especially during Michigan summers, created chronic inflammation. The scars became more pronounced, more keloid, because they never had a chance to heal properly. If you'd allowed the wounds to breathe 40 years ago, if you'd sought proper treatment, the scarring would be significantly less visible today." Sarah watched the color drain from Thomas's face as the implications sank in. He'd been hiding scars that his hiding had made worse. The very thing he'd thought was protecting him from shame had been deepening the source of that shame. 40 years, Thomas whispered. 40 years of making it worse. Dr. Stevens leaned forward. "Thomas, with modern reconstructive techniques, we can reduce the scarring by 60 to 70%. It won't eliminate it completely, but it will give you your life back." "My life back?" Thomas's voice was bitter. "Doctor, I'm 85 years old. My wife is dead. I've spent 40 years hiding from the world. What life is there to get back?" The answer came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Henderson knocked on the hospital room door that afternoon, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and an expression of nervous determination. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband, "I owe you an apology." Thomas looked startled. In all their years as neighbors, Mrs. Henderson had never addressed him by his first name. "Eleanor, you don't owe me anything." "Hush and let me talk. I've been your neighbor for 23 years, and I've spent most of that time whispering about you with the other ladies. Why does he wear that scarf? What's he hiding? Maybe he's dangerous. We turned you into the neighborhood mystery instead of the neighborhood friend." She set the cookies on his bedside table and pulled up a chair. "Yesterday, Dr. Rodriguez told Pastor Williams about your crisis counseling work. Do you know what that means, Thomas? Thomas shook his head. It means that while we were gossiping about you hiding something terrible, you were spending your evenings saving lives. It means that while we were treating you like a curiosity, you were being a hero. Again. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor, and I'm not finished. Jenny Morrison from Peterson's called me this morning. You know Jenny, the checkout girl you've been polite to for 15 years but never really talked to. Well, her brother Jake is a Marine veteran. Iraq, 2 tours. He's been struggling since he got back. Thomas's attention sharpened. PTSD? Among other things. Jenny heard about your counseling work and asked if you'd be willing to talk to Jake, not on the crisis line, but in person, face to face. The request seemed to terrify Thomas more than any medical procedure. Eleanor, I can't. People seeing me, knowing what I look like. Thomas Mitchell, you listen to me. I've seen your face now, and you know what I see. I see a man who threw himself into fire to save someone else. I see a man who spent 40 years helping others while thinking he was too broken to deserve help himself. I see a man this community needs, scars and all. Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched Thomas struggle with Mrs. Henderson's words. The old woman wasn't finished. You want to know what's terrible, Thomas? Terrible is letting shame steal 40 years of your life. Terrible is dying alone when a whole community would have loved you if you'd let them. Terrible is Jake Morrison drinking himself to death because he's too proud to ask for help, and you're too scared to offer it in person. The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital life. Thomas stared at his hands, probably seeing them clearly for the first time in decades without gloves or long sleeves to hide the burn scars that extended down his arms. What if I can't do it? He whispered. What if I meet with Jake and he takes one look at me and runs? Then he runs, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. But what if he doesn't? What if he sees someone who understands what it's like to come home broken and finds hope that broken doesn't mean worthless? Dr. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. Thomas, I'd like to suggest something. What if we start small? What if Jake comes here to the hospital where you feel safe? You can meet him in this environment with Sarah and me present if that makes you more comfortable. And if it goes well? Thomas asked. Then maybe next week we try the VA office, and maybe the week after that we try a coffee shop. Small steps, Thomas. The same way you've been helping other veterans take small steps toward healing. Thomas looked around the room, at Sarah, who had seen his scars and stayed, at Dr. Rodriguez, who valued his work more than his appearance, at Mrs. Henderson, who had turned 40 years of neighborly distance into unexpected friendship. For the first time since 1975, he was surrounded by people who knew what he looked like and chose to be there anyway. All right, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell Jake I'll meet with him, but Sarah has to be here. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah assured him. And Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor, will you stay too, in case I lose my nerve? Eleanor Henderson smiled the first genuine smile she'd ever given her mysterious neighbor. Thomas, I've been waiting 23 years to finally have a real conversation with you. I'm not leaving now. As the afternoon sun slanted through the hospital room windows, Thomas Mitchell made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He asked Dr. Stevens to bring him a mirror. When she returned with a small hand mirror, Thomas took it with shaking hands and looked at his reflection for the first time in 40 years. And the face that looked back at him was scarred, yes, but it was also the face of a man who had saved lives, both in Vietnam and in the decades since. Hello, Thomas, he said to his reflection. It's time we got reacquainted. 3 days after Thomas first looked in the mirror, the weight of 40 years crashed down on him like a collapsing building. Sarah arrived for her morning visit to find him sitting in the dark, having pulled the hospital room curtains closed and turned his face toward the wall. "I can't do it," he said, before she could even speak. "I thought I could, but I can't. It was a mistake. All of it was a mistake." Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd seen this before with trauma patients, the moment when hope felt more terrifying than despair, when the possibility of healing seemed like another way to be hurt. "Thomas, what happened?" "I called Carl Morrison last night. Carl, the law student who wanted to thank me." Thomas's voice was flat, emotionless. "I told him who I really was, described my face so he'd be prepared. You know what he said?" Sarah waited, dreading the answer. "He said he had to think about it, that he'd call me back." "That was 18 hours ago." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Even the people I saved can't stand to look at me." "Thomas." "No." He held up his hand. "I was fooling myself. Eleanor was being kind, you were being professional, Dr. Rodriguez was being diplomatic. But when it comes to real life, when it comes to actually facing this," he gestured at his scars, "nobody can handle it. Not even the people who owe me their lives." Sarah sat down heavily in the chair beside his bed. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the inevitable crash that often followed breakthrough moments in trauma recovery. The question was whether Thomas had enough fight left in him to climb out of this pit, or whether 40 years of shame would finally claim him completely. "You're right," she said quietly. Thomas looked startled. He'd clearly expected her to argue, to offer false reassurance. "You're right that this is harder than I made it sound. You're right that some people might not be able to handle seeing your scars. You're right that after 40 years of hiding, showing yourself to the world is terrifying." Thomas stared at her, confusion replacing the flat despair in his eyes. "But you're wrong about Carl Morrison." Sarah pulled out her phone. "He didn't call you back because he needed to think about meeting you. He called the hospital this morning asking for your room number. He's been in the lobby for 2 hours, too nervous to come up because he's afraid you'll change your mind about seeing him." "What?" "He drove all night from Detroit to get here. Not because he had to think about whether he could face your scars, but because he needed time to figure out how to thank the man who saved his life without breaking down crying in front of him." Thomas's facade cracked slightly. "He's here? Now?" "He's 24 years old, Thomas. He lost 3 friends in Iraq, came home with survivor's guilt that was eating him alive, and was planning to kill himself the night he called the crisis line. You talked him through that night and 17 other calls over the following months. He's not here out of obligation. He's here because you literally gave him his life back." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, pulling open the curtains. Light flooded the room, making Thomas wince and turn away. "But here's the thing, Thomas. If you want to hide again, if you want to put that scarf back on and pretend the last week never happened, I'll help you do it. I'll tell Carl you're not ready, I'll make excuses to Dr. Rodriguez, and I'll support whatever decision you make." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "You'd do that? After everything we've been through?" "Of course I would." "Because that's what people who care about you do. They support your choices, even when they disagree with them." Sarah's voice became gentle, but firm. "But I need you to understand something before you decide. The Thomas Mitchell I met 6 months ago was already dying. Not from his breathing problems, not from his isolation, but from carrying shame that was too heavy for one person to bear." She sat back down, leaning forward to make sure he was really listening. "You can put the scarf back on, Thomas. You can go home and close your curtains and spend whatever time you have left hiding. But that man down in the lobby, he'll still know that you saved his life. Jake Morrison will still need help with his PTSD. The 47 other veterans you've counseled will still owe you their lives. Your choice isn't whether to be a hero. You've already been a hero for 40 years. Your choice is whether to let anyone else see what a hero looks like." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What if I meet with Carl and I break down? What if I can't handle seeing the look in his eyes?" "Then you break down. And Carl will probably break down too, because that's what happens when two people who've survived trauma finally get to look each other in the eye and say, 'I understand.' And what if it doesn't help? What if facing all this doesn't make the shame go away?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Thomas, I don't think the shame will ever completely go away. I think shame is the price we pay for loving people we couldn't save, for surviving when others didn't, for being human in situations that demanded more than human strength." Thomas looked up at her, his scarred face reflecting 40 years of accumulated pain. "But," Sarah continued, "I think shame gets smaller when we share it. I think it gets lighter when we stop carrying it alone. And I think maybe, just maybe, when Carl Morrison looks at your scars and doesn't run away, you might start to believe that you're worthy of being seen." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital life, footsteps in corridors, muffled conversations, the electronic symphony of medical equipment. Thomas sat with his head bowed, and Sarah could almost see him weighing 40 years of hiding against the possibility of connection. Finally, he looked up. "Is he really down there? Carl?" "He really is. He's wearing a Detroit Lions jacket and carrying a backpack full of law books. He keeps checking his phone and looking toward the elevators." Thomas took a shaky breath. "What would I say to him?" "Maybe start with hello," Sarah suggested gently. "And then maybe you let him say what he came here to say." "Which is what?" "Thank you. Thank you for staying on the phone with him when he wanted to die. Thank you for understanding what it felt like to come home broken. Thank you for proving that survival is possible, even when it doesn't feel like it." Thomas was quiet for another long moment. Then slowly, he reached up and touched the scars on his neck, not hiding them, not covering them, but acknowledging them. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. But you have to stay in the room. I'll stay as long as you need me to. And if I change my mind, if I can't handle it, then we'll deal with that when it happens. There's no shame in having limits, Thomas. There's only shame in letting fear make all your decisions." Thomas nodded slowly, then looked directly at Sarah for what felt like the first time since his breakdown had begun. "Will you call him? Will you tell him I'd like to meet him?" Sarah smiled, feeling something that had been tight in her chest begin to loosen. "I'll call him right now." As she dialed the number Carl had left at the nurse's station, Sarah watched Thomas straighten his shoulders and run his fingers through his gray hair. He was preparing to meet someone who knew him only as a voice in the darkness, someone who would now see the face behind the words that had saved his life. The phone rang twice before a young, nervous voice answered. "Hello? Carl? This is Sarah Jenkins, Thomas Mitchell's nurse. He's ready to see you now." The relief in Carl's voice was audible through the phone. "Really? He's sure?" Sarah looked at Thomas, who nodded firmly, despite the fear still visible in his eyes. "He's sure. Room 314. Take your time coming up. He's nervous too." After she hung up, Thomas looked at her with something approaching wonder. "I can't believe I'm doing this." "Neither can I," Sarah admitted. "But Thomas, I'm proud of you. Martha would be proud of you too." For the first time since his breakdown, Thomas smiled. "I hope so. God, I really hope so." New Year's Day, 2024, dawned clear and cold in Millbrook, Michigan, painting the small town in shades of white and gold that made everything look like a fresh beginning. Thomas Mitchell stood at his kitchen window watching neighbors emerge from their houses to collect newspapers and wave to each other across snow-covered lawns. For the first time in 40 years, he wasn't watching from behind curtains. The man who looked back at him from the window's reflection bore little resemblance to the hidden figure who had haunted this house for 4 decades. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined his entire existence. Instead, they had become part of a larger story, one that included courage and sacrifice, survival and redemption. The meeting with Carl Morrison had changed everything. The young law student had walked into that hospital room carrying his own scars, invisible ones carved by improvised explosive devices and the ghosts of friends who hadn't made it home from Iraq. When Carl had seen Thomas's face for the first time, he hadn't recoiled. Instead, he had sat down, looked directly at the burn scars, and said, "So that's what strength looks like." They had talked for 3 hours that first day. Carl shared his story, the guilt of surviving when his best friend David had been killed by a roadside bomb just 10 feet away, the nightmares that made sleep impossible, the feeling that he didn't deserve the life David had lost. Thomas had listened with the patience of someone who understood every word, and when Carl finished, Thomas had shared his own story. Not just the phone counselor's version he'd perfected over 15 years, but the whole truth. Rodriguez, the white phosphorus, Martha dying without ever seeing his face. "You know what the difference is between us?" Carl had said as the sun set outside the hospital window. "You've been carrying your guilt for 40 years. I've only been carrying mine for 3. Maybe you can teach me how to put it down before it takes 4 decades of my life too." That conversation had led to others. Jake Morrison, Jenny's brother from Peterson's grocery store, had been the second veteran to visit. Then came Patricia Williams, a Navy nurse struggling with PTSD from her deployment to Afghanistan. Then Marcus Johnson, a young Marine whose injuries had left him feeling as hidden from the world as Thomas had been. Dr. Rodriguez had formalized the arrangement, creating a peer counseling program based at the Millbrook VA office with Thomas as the lead coordinator. Guardian Angel Tom had finally stepped out of the shadows, and the results had been remarkable. Veterans who had resisted traditional therapy were eager to talk to someone whose scars, visible and invisible, proved that survival was possible. The program had grown beyond anything anyone had imagined. The Thomas Mitchell Peer Support Network now served 3 counties, with Thomas training other veteran volunteers to provide face-to-face counseling. The success rate was unprecedented, not because Thomas was a miracle worker, but because he had learned the most difficult lesson of all, that healing happens not when we hide our wounds, but when we share them. Sarah knocked on his door at exactly 10 o'clock, as she had every Tuesday for the past 6 months. But now she came as a friend rather than a healthcare provider, and Thomas answered wearing a simple sweater instead of his armor of wool. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, stamping snow off her boots. Thomas nodded, though she could see nervous energy in his movements. Today was the dedication ceremony for the new Millbrook Veterans Memorial, and Thomas had been asked to speak. It would be his first public appearance before the entire community, not hidden in the back of church or rushing through grocery store aisles, but standing in front of everyone who had whispered about him for decades. "I keep thinking about Martha," Thomas said as they drove toward the town square. "About how she waited 44 years for me to trust her enough to show her who I really was. I never got the chance to apologize for that." Sarah glanced at him as they stopped at a red light. "Thomas, I need to tell you something. After you were in the hospital, I went through Martha's things that Mrs. Henderson had stored in her basement." Thomas looked surprised. "Eleanor never mentioned that, because I asked her not to until I was sure." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal. "This was in a box marked private. I think Martha meant for you to find it someday." Thomas took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft with age, the pages filled with Martha's careful handwriting. He opened it randomly and began to read. June 15, 1987. Tom was working in the garden today, and the heat made him pull his shirt off in the backyard. He didn't know I was watching from the kitchen window. The scars on his back and arms are extensive, much worse than I had imagined. My beautiful, brave husband has been carrying this alone for 12 years. I want so desperately to tell him that I see him, all of him, and I love every scarred inch. But I know he needs to be the one to show me when he's ready. Until then, I'll wait. I'll love him from a distance that feels too far, but is the only distance he can handle. Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he continued reading entry after entry spanning decades. Martha had known. She had always known. She had seen him in unguarded moments, sleeping, working in the garden, stepping out of the shower, and had documented not just the extent of his scars, but her unwavering love for the man who bore them. December 3, 2018. The cancer is getting worse, and I'm running out of time to wait for Tom to trust me with his truth. I've decided to write him a letter to be opened after I'm gone. Maybe then he'll understand that love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. I've been present for 43 years waiting for him to join me. Sarah watched Thomas read, saw the decades of guilt beginning to transform into something approaching peace. She knew, Thomas. She always knew, and she loved you anyway. The memorial dedication drew the largest crowd Millbrook had seen in years. Veterans from 3 counties had come to honor their fallen comrades, but also to see the man who had become a legend in veteran circles. The burned hero who had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight before finally stepping into the light. When Thomas took the podium, the crowd fell silent. Many were seeing his face clearly for the first time, but there were no gasps of shock or uncomfortable murmurs. Instead, there was the respectful quiet of people recognizing courage when they saw it. 40 years ago, Thomas began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I came home from Vietnam believing that my scars made me unworthy of being seen. Today, I stand before you understanding that our scars, visible and invisible, are not marks of shame. They are proof that we survived something that tried to break us. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces that included Carl Morrison, Jake Morrison, Patricia Williams, Marcus Johnson, and dozens of other veterans he had helped find their way back to the light. This memorial honors those who didn't make it home, but I believe they would want us to honor something else too. The courage to keep living, to keep connecting, to keep showing up for each other even when we feel broken, especially when we feel broken. As Thomas concluded his speech, the crowd rose in sustained applause. But he was looking at one face in particular, Sarah's, seeing in her expression the same thing Martha had written about in her journal. Love that saw everything and chose to stay anyway. Later that evening, as Thomas sat in Martha's chair for the first time since her death, he opened her journal to the final entry. My dearest Tom, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found the courage to let someone see you. I'm so proud of you. I always have been. Welcome home, my beautiful, scarred, perfect husband. Welcome home. Outside, snow began to fall again, but Thomas no longer saw it as something to hide behind. Instead, he saw it as what it had always been, a clean slate, a fresh beginning, a chance to write a new story. The scarf that had held 40 winters was finally at rest, buried with the shame it had carried. And Thomas Mitchell, scarred but no longer hidden, was finally, truly home. For 40 years, Thomas Mitchell believed his scars made him unworthy of love, hiding behind a wool scarf that became his prison. Like so many of us who've lived through decades of life's battles, whether from war, illness, loss, or simply the accumulated wounds of time, Thomas thought his pain was too ugly to share. But here's what Martha's hidden journal revealed. She had seen his scars all along and loved him more not less, because of them. She understood that those marks weren't flaws to be hidden, but proof of a man brave enough to throw himself into fire to save another human being. Thomas's story reminds us that the very things we're most ashamed of, our scars, our struggles, our moments of breaking, are often the things that make us most capable of healing others. At 85, Thomas finally learned what many of us over 55 need to hear. It's never too late to step into the light, to let people see our authentic selves, and to discover that real love doesn't require perfection, it requires presence. The courage to be vulnerable isn't just for the young. Sometimes wisdom means finally taking off the scarves we've worn for decades. What scarf have you been wearing to hide your authentic self? Have you ever discovered that someone loved you more for the very thing you thought made you unlovable? Share your story in the comments. Your courage might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.